All right, good morning, welcome. I am Leon, as you may have heard. I'm really excited to be here. It's actually amazing to see so many hackers in Johannesburg. I don't know where you are all when you're offline, but it's really nice to see a whole bunch of cool people together. And I'm quite excited to be in front of you today. I'm definitely nervous. Like, just get that out of the way. You're going to look at me and I'm going to shake and I'm be a little bit worried. But I think, with the energy from you, we'll make this awesome. So yeah, welcome to my talk called Your Contributions Today. And I hope I can convince you of a few things. First things first, my name is Leon Jacobs. I work for a company called Orange Cyber Defense. I'm in the Sensors team more specifically. And the stuff I like is research, building tools, and generally just hacking stuff. If I can break something, I'm probably quite interested in what that might mean and how that might go. So that's a little bit about me. Online, you can find that little silly avatar, which I can't remember where I got that. But I have a very creative hacker handle, LeonJZA. But okay, on to what I want to talk about with you today. I really have one agenda item that I want to talk about. And that is something where I want to try and convince you. I want to convince you of sort of a few things, but we'll try and keep this a little bit simple. Most importantly, what I want to convince you is to contribute more. And this is something that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And the second part to that is I want to convince you that you're actually able to do that. Your ability to contribute might be something that you're not realizing what that could be. And maybe in this talk today, I could finally change that a little bit for you. And the way I'm going to try and do this today is sort of two parts. The first, I'm going to try and reflect a little bit honestly on what security research looks like today. Modern security research, practical security research. What is that going to be if we had to think about it? The second way I want to do that is sort of reflect and share a little bit of a personal story on how I've tried to navigate what some of these things might look like by way of example of what this could mean for you. But before I can get into that part, I probably need to define a bit of a problem statement. Like, what do I think is wrong here in the first place? And that's a little bit that I want to do first. I'm going to share two examples, which are obviously very convenient for me, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second. But I'm going to ask you to engage with me a little bit here, and let's see how that goes. Now, no presentation from me is a presentation if there's not some random code that I threw at you. So this is the first of two slides that will have code. But by show of hands, is there anyone in this room that might have an idea of where this line of code comes from? It's actually a few lines on this slide, but does anyone have a rough idea? Not expecting a lot of answers here. Yeah, one, excellent. All right, this actually comes from Nmap. If you were to run Nmap on the 1st of September, this line of code will actually write a log entry congratulating itself, happy birthday, And if you did it this year, it would have been its 26th birthday. Now, the code itself, it seems quite complicated. There's this ternary in the middle, needs to figure out an ordinal to use for first, second, third. But that's not important. The point is this is the piece of code that will run because Nmap congratulates itself, happy birthday. So the first part, okay, not a lot of people recognize the code, but the more important question is how many people here have actually used Nmap before, right? I'm expecting significantly more hands to go up. Absolutely, yes, 2 hands. You used it twice this morning, I'm sure. I mean, Nmap genuinely is like a staple. If you want to know what's on the other side in terms of what can I potentially attack, knowing what open ports are there is quite a useful bit of information to enumerate. The third question that I then want to ask on this, and it's the last question on this code before we'll move to the next, is how many folks here have contributed something towards Nmap? This tool, almost everyone in this room has used, has contributed in some way. Roughly about the same amount of hands that went up in terms of how many have seen the code. Okay, don't worry too much about that because hopefully we can change that a little bit. I've got one more example that I want to show you. This is my favorite of the two of this type of examples. But the same question, how many folks potentially recognize where this code might come from? It's got this macro saying gaping security hole, this execcl call. No, not too sure. One, of course, you heard this yesterday, it doesn't count, Dominic. All right, so if you didn't know, this actually is a piece of code that comes out of Netcat. If you use the -e flag in Netcat, which spawns some program, now we're hackers in the room, probably a reverse shell, bash, sh, whatever the story might be. This is actually the piece of code, truthfully it's part of 2 methods in which it can happen, but that doesn't matter now. That would actually spawn that shell, connect a file descriptor and get you some standard in, standard out going. How many folks here have used Netcat? Probably everyone. If you started some form of hacking somewhere, the first command you ran was netcat-e. Right? Significantly more. Now, the thing I wanted to show with this sort of these two examples is the ratio between the amount of people who might recognize a piece of code, not write it, just have a sort of an idea of how these things might work, is very little. In comparison to the amount of people that have used this software. And Netcat, Nmap, absolutely. Speak to someone who's doing cybersecurity for 2 days. Chances are good they've either heard of or used this. I actually fondly remember the first time someone asked me if I seen Nmap, and I sort of said my answer was no. Little did they know what an impact that answer would have had in my career. My ability to scan stuff, vuln scan, etc., is genuinely amazing. But I think this sort of comes down to a much more important point. Increasingly, my worry is that we get used to the fact that it's okay to not really know how these things work. Now, I'm not saying you must absolutely be able to recognize a piece of code. Maybe this one you will now. But the point here being is knowing how that reverse shell actually gets spawned is quite a handy thing to understand. And my worry is, and where we're going, is it's less of a thing to know how things really work. And that sort of brings me to the second part of this point. If less people know how stuff really works, how would we really understand how systems are supposed to be designed in a secure way? One argument could be, why is it hard to know how stuff works? Well, honestly, the complexity of the systems that we're facing today are just increasing. It's so much harder to actually know how Netcat spawns a shell than also trying to figure out how Kubernetes functions. Truthfully, Kubernetes for me was one of those things where I hoped the technology would just go away. Turns out I was very, very wrong in my assumption over there. But I think this leaves us in a genuinely bad state. We don't really know how stuff works, so we can't make good design decisions in the software that we build or the systems that we want to defend. This is not a great state. The second part of this thing, like maybe you're not the person that wants to know how Netcat actually spawns that shell, but because we might not be sharing the knowledge of what you've just learned, I fully expect you to tell someone you now know how Netcat spawns a shell. We're not sharing that knowledge in terms of what we know, and people are now sort of defending in isolation. If you've got a really interesting way of approaching a security problem and you're not sharing it with someone else, that person probably needs to fight that fight on their own and learn the same lessons that you have learned already. We're not collaboratively actually benefiting from this work that we're all working on. And that's not a great space to be in. The way I think we can do better here is by this idea of being able to contribute a little bit more. But before I speak about that at length, we probably need to define a little bit, what do I mean by a contribution? I think a lot of people get contributions and research wrong. It's not the same thing. Research is a side effect or one of the ways in which you can contribute. A contribution can quite literally be fix the documentation so that it is actually correct. Using something in the right way is a useful thing to know. You don't want to have to read Netcat source code to see how -e is implemented to know what the -e flag does. Maybe we can fix the docs if that's not correct. If you don't know how to write code, that's fine. Maybe you can do something, Nmap has this thing called service probes. I'll reword that example a bit. If you scan a remote service, Nmap has a bit of a database to know how do these services behave, and that way know how to interact with it. Without you knowing how to write any code, except knowing how to read documentation, maybe you have some new kit that you can scan, you can submit a service probe towards Nmap, and the next person who scans that now can also identify what that thing is, what that device is that you might be scanning. It's a contribution you can make without writing code, quite literally, and not a hard thing to do. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a pull request in the Nmap repository for a KNX probe. So the next time you scan an OT environment and you have the latest version of Nmap, they'll probe how does this device work. It's just quite amazing. The last thing, though, and probably the easiest one for all of us to do, talks a little bit about the education part of this. Show someone else how this stuff works. Teach them the ways of maybe how the Netcat-E flag is implemented. Who knows? Maybe they're the ones who write the next version of Netcat or the equivalent. Who knows what that might be? But the input you would have in someone in that case is a meaningful contribution and one that can actually make us go forward. But OK, I've showed you some code, a very convenient analogy. Show people who don't write code, won't recognize it. It worked in my favor. But I sort of want to talk a little bit in the second part of where I think how some of this stuff might not be going so well. And there's this concept that I think about a little bit that I'm going to call an InfoSec free rider, right? I Googled this. I don't see this term referenced anywhere, so maybe I said it, I don't know. But the concept, I think, is quite important. And I want to isolate the word free rider for a little bit and tell you if you may not have heard of this idea of the free rider problem. And the free rider problem is actually something from the economics world, where it effectively says, if there is something that you can't charge someone specifically for, the chances are really good that free riders start emerging. You have a park, it's a public park. How can someone stop you from going to that park? They can't. But how does the park exist? It exists because someone actually went and made it nice, put some lawn, maintains the trees, makes the thing going. But the problem is the longer and the more people come and abuse this park by not investing back, maybe not just pulling out that weed when they walk past or whatever contribution they can make, the park becomes overrun, it's not well maintained, and eventually becomes, honestly, not a great place to be. And this is true for many things. A road, you can't necessarily charge someone in isolation, a library, all of these public things. There are systems in where people can try and avoid this. You'll go, cool, we have e-toll, it's a pain. Sure, taxing is one of the arguments in reducing the probability of free riding. But it's sort of this idea that people sort of get benefit from something without investing, and it gets increasingly worse as time goes ahead. If you dive into this concept a little bit, you'll see some people actually say they think this is an unsolvable problem. It's not something I like reading. When someone says it's an unsolvable problem, I think we need to unpack it a little bit more. Surely there's something we can do over here. I think there's some similarities to InfoSec in this case, which is why I'm going with this InfoSec free rider thing. There's almost zero incentive for us often to contribute back. If you want to go do a pen test today, there are hundreds of tools you can freely download on GitHub. Just fire a laser, get DA, or whatever your objective might be, and win. Without having understood how that tool works, without having made a meaningful contribution. To the point where if your exploit doesn't work, you go to the dark web, which is page 2 of Google, and you try another one, right? It's much easier to just try another exploit than actually going back and realizing, but why did that fail? Is it a fake exploit? I hope that hasn't happened to you. But maybe there's a small bug you could have contributed back to fix that, and it's just better for everyone. But instead, I think we get to the place where I'll just try another one. That one might get me what I want. And this sort of exacerbates this problem where I think it's increasingly more that we find that we don't want to contribute back, we don't really understand how things work, and we just move to the next page to try something else. Now, while continuing on this analogy of this free rider, there was some more thinking about this problem, and there's this idea of the free rider cycle. And this is something by a German economist called Albert Otto Hirschman. I hope I pronounced that right. And he sort of says, look, the way this cycle moves as people's interests move. As we go along in this cycle, its influence in the state in which we're at is based on what people's interests are at that time. And I'm going to try and demonstrate what some of this might mean. So the first bit of this, it's a circle. So we kind of need to pick a starting point and where are we in this cycle. Maybe you're a pessimist, so I'll start at the bad side of the cycle. And we'll get to this first part here. So one part of this cycle is, all right, people in this state of mind are acting in self-interest. There are closed and private groups for you. If you're going to get into the golf course, you need to pay a bunch of money, because you're part of this club. And not everyone is allowed in. You can't just do what you want. The way for you to get in is you're clearly charged, and you can reap the benefit of this environment that we're in. Hirschman's example that he uses is sort of in a job setting. He says, if people act in a high-stress environment, and maybe there's a risk of them losing their jobs, they tend to form small self-interest groups to sort of like have a bit of self-preservation. The way for them to make sure they'll survive is to make sure that they can sort of react in their interests, what they need to do. The more important point here is like the public good does not matter here. They don't really care about the other people. They need to get themselves out of this stressful situation. But now this is a circle, time progresses on that circle, and at some stage during this cycle, the stress sort of reduces. Hirschman's example could be, the risk of you losing your job is now less. And people start looking around them, start realizing, hold on, it would be nice if we had this park. It would be really nice if we had this facility that we could use, that other people could use. Some people within the groups could argue, but why must us that can afford this thing benefit from this and not the others? That's not a great state to be. And eventually the cycle sort of moves over into this case where people move towards collective action. What's the public good that we can get out of this thing? What's that park, that library, that street that we can build that a lot of people can benefit from it? And this, again, as people's interests have now changed, to sort of move into this part of the cycle. But OK, I'm nearly done with this analogy. The unfortunate part of this stage is now, cool, this is a really nice park, and someone realizes, I don't have to pay. And these guys rock up. Free riders, It's actually really nice. I don't have to contribute anything. I sit on a really nice comfy chair. I enjoy a pretty lawn. And when I'm done, I'm out of here. And then I go tell 10 friends, hey, come check this thing out. I can chill on this bench. And it's great. It's free. There's no investment. No one pulled the weed out of the grass or trimmed the tree or anything like that. And when I think about this from an InfoSec perspective, I think this is that crowd that asks you, when's the jailbreak going to be available? They don't care about the exploit. It's like, when can I have this? I want to install my tweak. Let's call it that. But OK, the point here is as far as the cycle goes, time goes on, and as people's interests change, they act in different ways. And I think the analogy for this thing in InfoSec is quite fitting. And I'll use a recent example of where I've seen exactly this cycle at play. I don't know how many folks here know of a tool called CrackMap Exec. Quite popular, right? You've either thought about using it, have used it, got busted using it, whatever your story might be. But it's useful in some situations. Now, the author original of that, Bytebleeder on Twitter, Marcello, sort of had this frustration that large companies, pen-test companies, corporates, they sort of benefit from this tool without giving anything back, right? Start seeing this cycle at play over here. No one is doing what they should be doing. They're just benefiting outright. And that's not a great state to be in. So what does he do? He comes up with this idea to do sponsorware for CrackMap Exec in a thing he called Porchetta Industries. And the basic idea is actually quite simple. We move these projects into a closed source system, into a private repository, and you pay for access to the features that you would get before they go public. And that timeline was roughly 6 months, maybe a little bit more. I don't know the real time. But what that practically means is you pay a little bit of money, you get access to the latest development of this tool, and you would know that after 6 months, this would go open source anyways. So it's a little bit of exclusivity for a short period of time, but eventually it would go open source. The way this went down is there was a developer that was actually paid with that money that sponsors paid to make sure the project was kept alive. There was some incentive for someone to continue building in this thing. Some money was involved. Eventually, this person that was paid decided, you know what, I'm done. I think I want to do something else. Totally fair choice to make. And it sort of sparked a little bit of drama, I think is what we would call it, InfoSec drama. A bunch of tweets calling people bad things. It's really unfortunate. But the net effect of that is, someone forks the repository. There's arguments about why can only a small community of people that pay get access to these features. It must be everyone. Everyone must have access to all of these features. And so one of the many forks, I think NetExec's probably the one that will make it, get made. And the unfortunate thing is, Marcello's response to this is as harsh as delete the Porchetta Industries Discord. This way this whole community was being driven, making sure the sponsorware model can work. Putting his heart and soul into that really sort of turns into this really uncomfortable thing. What the right call was, I don't know. There's a lot going on. But you can sort of see the cycle at play over here. Small amount of people get access, we reduce. Suddenly, we want everyone to have access again. And it brings you to the next sort of thing where there's definitely a trend where a ton of research is generally just not made public anymore. It's not to be confused with people talk publicly about their research. Absolutely, people are doing really cool stuff. But the guts of it does not necessarily see the light of day. And in some cases, it could be seen as quite problematic. I think one of the really interesting examples of this is sort of this rise of closed-sourced C2s. We have people talking about all these cool features they have, but no one, you don't have the code for doing that. People would have their implementation and what they think it was, but necessarily the actual source is not there. The technique exists, but a small group of people have access to that. Now, I'm not here to say is that a good or a bad thing, but it's sort of something to think about. We don't need another C2. I can definitely tell you that. Please write one to learn, but it's not another commercial C2 probably is not going to solve the problem here. But it's interesting to think about that in the context of this cycle. Okay, so I've said a whole bunch of things about this, this free rider thing. And what I really want to encourage you is to not be a free rider. We don't need to contribute more to this effect that we have that makes the closed non-useful for the community situations. But to sort of bring that into a different perspective, and I want to change gears over here, when I was preparing for this talk, I thought, okay, what's the way in which I can demonstrate practically, like, okay, cool, you're telling me I must make contributions. You don't want to do this free rider thing. How would I do that? Now, every presentation starts with 3 words: why, how, what, which could be, why am I doing this presentation? How am I going to do it? What's the point? But no, I could ask different questions, like, why should I contribute? How do I start? And what do I contribute? And even in that case, you can sort of end over here. The why, well, it's fun. How do I start? Well, just poke at something. What's that interesting thing? Poke. And what do I do? So really anything that you're interested in. If that's interesting to you, please start doing that thing. And we can call this a day. Done. We've learned what we did. But I thought, no. I think the way for us to dive into this is to shuffle this around, play with some different questions, and see if we can get to a different sort of answer. And that's sort of what I've done. So the 3 questions I sort of want to ask myself here is actually, what is the goal? What is the thing that I want to achieve with this contribution that I intend on making? The second part that is, how would I get there? How would I actually get to the point that contribution is now part of the system, is something that actually has this effect of being useful for someone else? And then finally, why should I, and frankly anyone, care about this? Why? So I'm going to take these 3 questions, I'm going to dive into them a little bit, but I'll do it with a tiny bit of a twist. I want to add a little bit of my personal experience in trying to answer these 3 questions and getting to some sort of conclusion. Today, it's known as objection. I wrote this mobile tool thing that lets you play around with apps. Details not too important. But there was a journey that got me to a point where it is today that I think is quite telling and tries to answer some of these questions. So I'm going to use that as some of the examples. The first question here to ask yourself, as you're sitting in this chair now, you go, what's the goal? Why? This sounds like something that you want to do. You're fired up. I don't know why yet, but this is something you want to do. And you sort of ask yourself, what's the goal? What's the thing that I need to do? Some examples of that could be, what? I want to find a vulnerability. I want to find some vulnerabilities in something pretty serious, and I want to report those. That's my goal. That's the thing I want to do. And it sounds pretty noble. It sounds like the right thing to do. Clearly, the outcome would be someone else can't exploit that vulnerability. But I think sometimes people, what they're actually saying is, I want a CVE against my name. That's why I want to find a vulnerability, which is a different outcome. It's not a bad outcome, absolutely. If you can get the CVE assigned, congratulations. That's the conundrum to navigate on its own. But the point here is, you don't have to lie to yourself in that, actually, I want to find vulnerabilities. No, you want to get a CVE, and you're going to optimize for finding vulnerabilities so that you can get to that point. And this is an important thing, to be honest with yourself. I might step on some toes over here, but maybe you're saying, well, I want to do some contribution or some goal towards bug bounties, which is great. The thing could be, hey, I want to fix large amounts of bugs because the internet needs to be safer for everyone. But you can't ignore the fact that, actually, maybe I'm doing bug bounties for the money component to it. And when you add the money to it, which is not necessarily a bad thing, you need to think about the outcome that you might be optimizing for here. Are you optimizing for research that's in-depth, that you truly understand how technology works? Or are you optimizing for a monetary outcome? Go for the bugs that pay the most, right? And I think that influences how you're going to approach this thing. The problem is, if you're not honest in that way, you sort of get to this place where, well, I didn't get to the goal that I thought I wanted. And maybe it's because you didn't realize really personally why are you doing this thing. So the what is the goal thing, those are some of the arguments for that. For me personally, though, often that goal wasn't clear. If I take the objection example, there was this Frida thing at the time. Didn't really understand what this does, but I was quite curious about what I can do with this. So what I do that everyone hardly does, I read the documentation and sort of get a sense of what's possible with this, and I play with it. I'm curious. Instrumentation is something I'm interested in personally. There's binary things involved. It's complex, but it's fun. And at that point, a colleague of mine, is doing a project, and this sort of problem statement arrives. He needs to do this thing in this mobile app. And at that point, it was really convenient for me. My initial goal of what can I do now changes into, hold on a second, I want to make this into something that could be really useful for this scenario that they're in. To the point where my goal changes, I think I need to build a file manager with Frida. Spoiler alert, today, if you run objection, you run Alice, it's because it was supposed to just be a file manager, nothing else. But that was sort of what my goal was. And it was this really nice coincidence that I had some hammer, there was a nail, and I was going to hit with it, right? But okay, what started as a bit of a toy turns into this file manager, and eventually as this journey goes along, I realize there's a ton more of things I can do. I can introduce code, make it do different things, and it's what it is today, this mobile hacking thing that you can play with. But that, it's sort of my experience and how that journey went. For the second question, is this point of like, okay, how do I get there? Now, for me, in terms of whatever objection is today, was not something that I knew I was going to get to in the beginning. Like, that's just the honest truth. It sort of evolved into that thing with contributions, with other people being part of that thing. It's not something I can do alone. It needed people to drive some of that idea. But I think the challenge we have in actually getting to a point of making a contribution is the reality that the easiest thing to do is to just do nothing. You can have all the intentions, you can, want to dive into this thing, you want to write that doc, but in reality, it's much easier to go and do something else, or nothing. The amount of excuses we might have at that point is a lot, because it's hard work. You need to invest and really push through in doing this thing. One of the things that I think for our generation that we face today, Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts are like these extremely short, insanely fast dopamine hits that you get that, just genuinely funny stuff there. It's really nice. The problem is you have one or two funny things pop up, and now you're hunting for the next really funny one. And your initial intention of 10 minutes turns into 2 hours. It's not part of the presentation. Although it's maybe pretty cool. Thanks for the effects. You intend on 10 minutes of doing this thing, and next moment, 2 hours is gone, and you don't really know what happened. So the how do I get there part sort of starts with actually getting started. It's the most uninteresting bit that I could probably tell you, but really committing to doing something, finding a little bit of time to sit down, poke at this thing, is probably going to leave you with more of a satisfied feeling than, I don't know if you can remember the last YouTube short you saw, maybe. Can you remember 5 ago? It's probably gone out of your mind already. But if you spend some meaningful time doing some research, figuring out what that contribution would be, that would last significantly longer. So yeah, I think we have a challenge as the Instagram generation. Now I need to do the cartwheel, right? Oh, they're rebooting it. Cool. Dad jokes? It's back. Okay, so now the part is you need to guess the slide. Do I unplug this thing, maybe? No, it's good. Aha. Okay, quickly before it goes away. Read that, make a note. Some very quick examples of the kinds of things that I think also, apart from our attention spans that might be reducing, there are some other excuses that I think we can have to just not starting. This has already been done. Someone has done this thing. I already made the joke, we don't need another C2. Genuinely, we probably don't. But your understanding on how that stuff works is not a waste of time. I can tell you how it works. That's what this presentation could be. Or you can have the experience in building one and learning in a way that no one else can help you with. The second one here is there can't possibly be something that I can add to this thing. And honestly, when I started with the Frida sort of journey, it's exactly where my mind was. There's no way, I think the creator of Frida is genuinely a genius. I'll say that publicly. There's nothing I can add to this conversation. But over time, as I understood it better, as I get more experience in playing with that thing, the reality of what my contribution could be here actually grows into something tangible, which is really, really good. The last question, and sort of the arguably the most important of them to focus on, is sort of the why should I or anyone really care about this thing? I'm telling you for 30 minutes, I don't know how long it's been, to contribute, do a bunch of things, but the point of all of that is probably quite important. And the way I would answer this initially would be the realization we need to have that you're part of something bigger. Sounds like this very virtuous thing, obviously. You're part of something bigger, you want to contribute, make the world a better place. But I think the reality of how small our industry is and how niche the work that we do is, the effect we have is exponential outside in the world. And one way to think about this, if we do our work well, if you develop secure software, if you find vulnerabilities before bad people do, if you understand technology, wrote documentation, taught people by way of some form of contribution, so that they actually can architect systems better. For example, the financial system probably doesn't crash tomorrow. Now you can think about this for a moment. Like if none of us can transact because some major vulnerability came out, like that's a bad thing. It jeopardizes food security, civil unrest, a whole bunch of like negative things that can paint this dystopia for you. The reality is in the work that we are doing in this very small audience is one that contributes to that not happening. As this unfortunate, almost intangible thing where you can't measure how good we are because nothing happened, but it's still something to sort of think about. You know, you have this really small SQL injection from the 90s that you found. You know, you face-palmed, but it's fixed, and someone else is not abusing that in a bad way. Similarly, you know, ESCOM definitely doesn't need more problems, but can you imagine if they needed to deal with a ton of extra vulnerability-related things that, you know, makes things worse? This is the bad thing, and I think a reality for us as South Africans. So the why I care, why you should care, I think is because you need to realize the contribution that you make to society as a whole is one that not a lot of people necessarily understand, but still has an impact such that things can function, like things work. You know, things are not just falling apart because all of us called it a day. You developed well, things are actually functioning. The why should I care, you know, the personal version of that thing, it's something I'll talk about a little bit more, but like the gratification of learning something will outlast your Instagram reel. You know, think about the last 10 or the YouTube short. It's things you generally won't forget. Your understanding of technology becomes one that you're only building on top of that. And that sort of brings me to almost the last point that I want to make here. There's a little bit of a personal reflection on this success and failures thing. For those that are consultants, you write reports. The only thing you write in a report usually is the success story, the things that worked. But you sort of have to reflect internally on the things that went wrong. And I have one such story. You know, I like writing tools. I get very excited about things that I think is going to break the internet. So I sort of find what I thought was a way domain fronting could be possible in a different way, right? So because I'm excited, I start writing some tools, like immediately. Like I need to scan the internet. I need to find more vulnerable things that have this permutation of what I think I found. I spend a week writing a bunch of code. I get an Alexa or a Cisco Umbrella top 1 million, and I fire it away. And I get 0 results, like nothing. A week's work, sort of sit at my desk, and honestly quite agitated at this point, like all of that for nothing. And in something I don't understand why I did it today, I CD'd one directory back and RM'd the entire project. I'm like, this is useless. You know, off you go. You know, when I tell this story publicly today, I go like, a bit of a overreaction there, right? Like I probably don't need to do that. As someone who's lost a lot of code, I get aggressively. But this project was just that one scenario where it doesn't happen. And you know, the takeaway I could have had at this point is this: like, what a complete failure. You know, I got no vulnerability. My goal was to break the internet, and I didn't achieve that. You know, this sucks. You know, insert more excuses. In reality, at that point, I had written like internet scanner type code. I had to parse HTTP responses. I had to parallelize network connections. Like I was doing a whole bunch of things which later in my tool development career helped immensely. Like I didn't learn the vulnerability that I thought I had. I learned a bunch of capabilities to scan things that was useful in a different way. So the reason I want to tell you this thing is like, sure, maybe the goal you have initially, the contribution you wanted to make doesn't work. But like learning to contribute to a project, learning to write some code, learning how to teach someone is genuinely a valuable skill that will probably outlast what your current objectives are. Okay, got the 5-minute warning, so that's perfect timing for sort of closing. I want to leave you with two thoughts. Deny yourself, deny people becoming InfoSec free riders. The cycle probably will make its way there where that's going to happen, and I genuinely think we're at a place where like free riding is probably okay, you know, and I think it should not be okay. Convince yourself, convince your peers, the thing they think they can contribute, they probably should, and do that. We need that. Our industry needs that. Our society quite literally needs that. And part of my objective was to convince you to make a contribution. So there's the second thought, like make that contribution today. When you get home tonight, that git commit you didn't do, commit it. The documentation you didn't write yet, or maybe have written, just never submitted. You know, do that thing. Or at the very least, go and try whatever that thing is you wanted to poke at and do that. With that said, thank you. I hope that was interesting. Yeah, thanks.